Hello, my name is Hilary Tierney. I'm from the Centre for Youth Research and Development at the Department of Applied Social Study in Maynooth University in Ireland. I'm very glad to have an opportunity to talk to you today a little bit about Irish youth work. And as I say in that slide, it's a very quick tour of Irish youth work, but I hope it'll be of some interest to you. The first thing, I suppose, is just a little bit about Ireland. So a small island off the west coast of Europe, a population of under 5 million in the Republic of Ireland. Ireland's been a republic since 1949, and that's something I'll come back to later. Unlike, like most countries in Western Europe, we do have an aging population, but we also, interestingly, have an increasingly young population. So the latest estimates based on our census of 2016 is that we will have over 1 million young people in the country in less than 10 years. So that's quite significant in terms of youth work and provision for young people, and a concern, I suppose, in the country overall for young people. But I suppose, having briefly set the scene, I want to talk a little bit about the origins of youth work. I mentioned earlier that we were a republic since 1949, and that has had a significant impact on the direction of youth work. Ireland has a history of colonisation. We were colonised by the UK for many centuries, and at the same time as youth work was born in the UK, so we're influenced by that in the 19th century, the late 19th century and early 20th century. We were influenced by those developments out of the UK, which were I suppose, brought to Ireland, but then very quickly took on a very particular Irish connotation or an Irish characteristic, and that really is to do, I suppose, with the history of the time and the idea and the fact that Ireland was rapidly moving towards independence. Which was achieved in 1922 after a bitter civil war, which has had an impact all along. But what it did do is it gave Irish youth work particular flavour. So the flavour of Irish youth work in the early days was very much related to ideas around nationalism and identity, and a particular sort of Irish identity, and also related to the role of the Catholic Church. Which has had a significant role in Irish social provision, I suppose, in lots of ways. And it has a particular characteristic for youth work. So, for instance, people will be familiar with the idea of sort of young people's voluntary participation, but in the Irish context, it's also important to think about that voluntarism is quite significant, quite significantly more than that. So, the idea of adult volunteers and sort of enshrining in some way the principle of adult voluntary participation in the lives of young people is quite significant, and also the role of voluntary organisations is quite significant, and that really relates to the concept of subsidiarity in Catholic social teaching, the idea in some way that the role of the state is not to provide what people could reasonably provide for themselves. So historically, in the Irish context, education services and other sort of health and welfare services have been provided by voluntary organisations rather than directly by the state. Of course, the state has become a major funder of those services, but the governance, for want of a better word, of those organisations is in the hands of volunteers. So that principle has had an impact on youth work, and one that also continues in youth work today. So it's important to remember that. I suppose the other bit is going back to the point that I made earlier about the particular characteristics. This quote from 1933 about the Girl Guide. So people will be familiar with the Girl Guides, but the Girl Guides in Ireland very quickly became Catholic Girl Guides. And as you can see from this quote, the idea is that the Catholic Girl Guides had a particular sort of identity and a particular sort of role, and that the idea of the Girl Guides was that the young women and the girls and young women would be very involved in the idea of the revival of a Gaelic culture, something distinctly Irish. People would study the language, they would play native games, learn native dance and songs. So you can see the idea that in some way that the guides were about sort of socialising young people and young women into a particular sort of culture. And I think that's significant for any form of youth work, is about what's our intention for this. If you think then about, the wider youth work sector, and this, I suppose, slide really shows you the logos from some of the key organisations in Irish youth work today. Each of those organisations, bar one, and I'll come back to that in a minute, have their roots very strongly in the voluntary organisations, and each are voluntary organisations. So while they may still employ youth workers, their boards of management, their governance is voluntary, and they engage significant numbers of adult volunteers, and they can trace each of those. So the Catholic Youth Care, which is the distinctly Catholic organisation based in the Archdiocese of Dublin, Foróige and Youth Work Ireland are national youth work organisations and have their roots in sort of rural youth club provision. CDYSB is the one anomaly and the one exception I talked about, and that is the only statutory youth service in the country, and was founded in 1942 as part of the vocational education sector. The other organisation which has a significant role today in terms of a coordinating role and a role about relating and communicating with the state on behalf of youth work is the National Youth Council, which was founded in 1969, and in some way also marks the period when the state, the Irish state that is, started to get involved in youth work and in terms of funding youth work and engaging youth work. So it was the first time, I suppose, of a significant a development of a relationship between the voluntary sector and the state. But to give you just an idea, the NYCI did a report on the economic value of youth work because, again, in common with most other parts of Europe, there's been an increasing concern in recent years about the conversation has turned to one of evidence and outcomes. And I suppose because in Ireland we went through a period of austerity after an economic crash, there was even more concern, I suppose, about public finances and what public finances were being spent on, and a concern to communicate the value of youth work. So that piece of research identified that it's just under 400,000 young people are engaged in youth work in Ireland across the country, which is quite a significant number of young people involved. But also importantly, you can see that there's over 40,000 adult volunteers who are involved with those young people. So a significant sort of voluntary workforce, for want of a better word. And then a much smaller paid workforce, so something under 1,400 paid staff across Irish youth work across the country. So you can see that the young people participating on a voluntary basis are quite high, and the number of adult volunteers is very high, and significantly the number of paid staff is quite small. And so it makes for an interesting, I suppose, characteristics of the Irish sector. What we do have since 2001, and I'm conscious that I'm leaving out a lot of the story, is we do have a Youth Work Act, and I think that is something that a lot of our colleagues in Europe wish that they had. So we have a youth work, a statutory definition of youth work, and you can see that in common with a lot of other definitions, a lot of practices, that it places youth work as an educational practice, and that it is based on young people's voluntary participation, that it is in some way concerned with their personal and social development, and that it's complementary to the formal and academic education. So it's a particular form of education. What's distinctive, I think, about the Irish Act is that it also recognises the role of the voluntary youth organisations and sees those as having a primary role, and in some way enshrines that in the Act. And I suppose the Act really in 2001 perhaps marks the beginning of significantly more involvement between that voluntary youth organisations and the state, and an increasing level of involvement by the state in developing youth policy and youth related policies on a much more consistent basis, to the extent, for instance, that in 2011 we had the first, and continue to have the first department, a first full government ministry focused on children and young people. So, for instance, to give you an idea of some of the things that have been happening, we have a national policy framework for children and young people. And what's important is that it's a whole government approach. It's not just for youth work. It's actually about with the stated aim of in some way making Ireland one of the best small countries in the world to grow up and raise a family. Now, of course, that's a huge aspiration, but it does say something about how the country sort of thinks about and how the state thinks about young people in the future. But you can also see in the title, Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures, you can also see that very particular focus on outcomes and planned outcomes. So the idea is that the youth policy framework is is related to 5 key outcomes. So the idea is that young people, that all government departments and all of those agencies, voluntary and statutory, that are working with young people would be working together in some way to achieve outcomes in these 5 key areas that you can see there. Following that, fairly within the next year or so, we have a national youth strategy, which is just starting to get rolled out at the minute. And this is, I suppose, in a way, a point of completion for this very short presentation. I think it would be interesting to come back in a couple of years' time and see what has happened by 2020 or 21, to see if the aspirations in this national youth strategy, the idea, it's quite clear that the idea is that it's about trying to enable young people to realize their maximum potential, respecting their rights, which I think is significant. It's about recognizing the rights of young people, hearing their voices, a commitment to ideas around sort of youth participation, and at the same time recognizing the duty of the state and the community world to protect young people and to support them. But it also sees, it places childhood in a way and youth in a way as a period of transition from childhood to adulthood. And I suppose it's in that space that youth work is trying to communicate, I suppose, the unique contribution that it can make to the lives of young people while they make that transition. Thank you.